Just a few weeks ago, I took a trip I'll never forget. With just my camera, backpack, sleeping bag, and a tent, I traveled to Africa to report on a crisis where tens of thousands of people have died and tens of thousands more are expected to die by this spring. It's been labeled ethnic cleansing, mass killing, even genocide. Almost 1.5 million people have been displaced from their homes. Hundreds of thousands of refugees have fled Sudan to the neighboring country of Chad, which is where my journey begins with part 1 of the Suffering of Sudan. Miriam is 16. She looks through what belongings she has left. Everything fits into just 3 sacks. She tells me she's an orphan now. Her mother and father were killed. Hussein is 10 years old. He says nothing but lifts his arm to show me his story. He fell fleeing his village and was shot 3 times. Here, food is scarce. When it's available, throngs of kids gather with their mothers. You can see the hunger in their faces. These refugees are part of the nearly 1.5 million people who have been driven out of their homes in Sudan. More than 70,000 others have already died in a crisis called the worst humanitarian situation in the world today by the United Nations. Almost 200,000 refugees have crossed the border to refugee camps like this one in the country of Chad.
I see the future as very bleak. Everything has changed.
This is Abdullah. He's 18 years old. We're inside the tent he lives in now. He has fled from Darfur with some of his family, but 3 brothers, all teenagers, were killed. Like Abdullah, refugees fearing for their safety have fled Darfur, a region in western Sudan about the size of Texas. So why is this tragedy taking place? These refugees are darker-skinned ethnic Africans, but the Sudanese government, based in the capital Khartoum, is made up of ethnic Arabs. While the crisis is often described in racial terms, there's much more to it. As droughts have made natural resources in Darfur scarce, it's created a power struggle over land and livestock between the local Arabs, mostly nomads, and the African tribes, who are primarily farmers. The Sudanese government sided with the Arabs in Darfur, so small groups of rebel ethnic Africans started opposing the government, launching small attacks. And in retaliation, Arab militias called Janjaweed, allegedly supported by the government, began burning villages and driving the darker-skinned Africans from Darfur. Rakia tells me the Sudanese government killed all of her friends. You say the Janjaweed came and burned your village. What did you see that day?
I was ill and could not stand, so my parents dragged me outside. When I got out of the house, dead bodies were scattered everywhere. I think I saw more than 100. The ground was filled with wounded, broken, dead people.
Rakia takes me inside another tent where her little cousin sleeps. On the canvas wall, he's drawn figures with AK-47s and helicopters, a sign of how the conflict weighs on the minds of those living here. Believe it or not, the refugees living here in this camp are considered the lucky ones. That's because they have the basics: food, water, and shelter. But what about those who aren't considered lucky? Right now we're driving very close to the border with Sudan. You can see it's very rocky and bumpy getting out here. There are a number of refugees, thousands of them living in these remote areas, and they're some of the ones most in need. I follow Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, to a remote village where they're monitoring a local health center.
In the last sort of half year, they've seen a massive influx of refugees. And you've seen the little building here, it's not accommodating for that. You know, they could not cope with the number of refugees that are here.
Doctors like Mahrate bring both medicine and know-how to help the people in these remote regions. Next to the clinic, under the shade of a neem tree, a large family of refugees sits, unable to get to the camps. But even with no place to live, they're relieved to be out of Darfur.
The Janjaweed came to our village. They came with weapons, attacked the village, and burned it. By my own eyes, I saw them throw 2 children into the fire.
Now, the Sudanese government says it's taking steps to rein in the Janjaweed militia, but the U.S., UN, and many in the international community say the Sudanese government isn't doing enough. Just last week, a number of aid workers were barred from working in Darfur.
You hear about this situation in the newspapers and you hear it in the news, but seeing them and listening to their voices is just,
It's
gosh.
wild. And what's so unbelievable is that every story is worse than the one you've heard before. Like I mentioned, it just becomes overwhelming after a couple of weeks, just how much these people have to deal with.
And it's still going on.
Yeah. To find out more about how the conflict in Sudan began, check out channel1.com. There you'll find an interactive package so you can get an in-depth look at who's involved and what's being done to stop the violence. Just click on The Suffering of Sudan.
Welcome back. Yesterday, you heard the stories of refugees who have fled what the U.S. is calling genocide in the African country of Sudan.
Seth Doan joins us now with part 2 of his series. Hi, Seth.
Hey, you guys. It's hard to fathom the enormity of the problem in Sudan. 70,000 people dead, 1.5 million displaced. But as I spent more time inside the refugee camps in Chad, where nearly 200,000 Sudanese are now living, I began to see that amid this crisis, life goes on, and many are working to make it better. So today we return to the country of Chad, which borders Sudan to the west, with part 2 of The Suffering of Sudan.
We go in.
Haroon, a refugee, lets me rest in his tent. On a plastic tarp he scribbled, "Teacher of children, but we have no school. He says I'll understand if I come back tomorrow." The next day, as the sun starts climbing, I realize the meaning of the sentence. Hundreds of students, who range in age from 1 to 32 years old, gather in the sand at this makeshift school inside this refugee camp. There are hundreds of students, but no classroom. So they meet very early in the morning to avoid the oppressive heat of the day. It's only 7:25 in the morning and it must already be 90 degrees here. Despite that, Haroon tells me, they're eager to learn. With no books to write in, they learn Arabic letters by drawing in the sand. Haroon tells me that education is the only way they can one day rule their country. And he says they've learned a song. Happy, happy we shall be! But happiness seems a far-off goal here.
The camp is designed for 15,000.
Langdon Greenhall is an American trying to make life better for some of these refugees. Working for the Red Cross, he's charged with building a new refugee camp.
People have lost their homes, they've lost their possessions, they've lost their livelihoods in so many different ways. And what we're trying to do is just assist them and give them some of those basic essentials until hopefully they can return home.
Langdon shows me the open land where a camp called Trageen will be. 16-year-old Jamia will be moving to Trageen. She's been a refugee for 8 months, living with very few resources outside another camp. What do you think about moving to the new camp today?
Since we've become refugees, I haven't filled my stomach even one day. I want to go to the new camp because it is better than here.
Uprooting their lives again, these Sudanese refugees gather what little they have left. Sometimes just plastic sheeting and blankets. Jamia helps load the truck. Her name is called, and she climbs in. This is how thousands of refugees have traveled across Chad to a temporary home in refugee camps. We arrive at Trageen, and Jamia peeks out at her new home. Jamia and her mother are screened by doctors, their bags are checked for weapons, and finally she gets to move into a new tent. As simple as it sounds, for Jamia, it's important.
I think life will be better than before.
There are almost 200,000 refugees like Jamia living in Chad. However, the refugee camps in Chad, pictured here in yellow, house just a fraction of those displaced from the fighting. There are more than 1 million displaced people living in camps, pictured in green, still inside Sudan. Back in Chad, refugees try to make life in these camps about more than just survival. In the market, boys sell tapes, women sell guavas, and blacksmiths fashion crude tools. Idris was a tailor in Darfur. He still makes clothing at this refugee camp, even though he says no one here can afford to buy it. Does he plan to return to Darfur to be a tailor again?
Inshallah.
Inshallah, God willing, he answers. Many of the refugees I spoke with did say they wanted to go back home to Darfur, but the UN estimates that if the security situation improves, up to 100,000 more refugees could cross the border into Chad. Of course, they also pointed out that if security really improved, there wouldn't be a need to leave Sudan at all.
Seth, what's amazing to me is that even with everything as bad as it is, with people no food and you have those young school children drawing letters in the sand, they're still able to keep in good spirits.
Well, that was one of the things I wanted to get across with this story, not to just talk about the despair, but the hope that was there, which you saw with people smiling, clapping when I'd walk through these refugee camps. And tomorrow I will journey into Sudan, into Darfur for part 3 of the series. Now, to see our special online report, check out channel1.com, where you'll find an interactive map that gives a better sense of the scope of the violence. Just click on the Suffering of Sudan.
Just this week, a peace deal was signed between Sudan's government and the rebels in Darfur. The goal is to end the hostilities and guarantee aid workers access to those suffering there.
We've been looking in depth at the crisis in Sudan, and Seth Doan joins us now with the conclusion of his series. Hi, Seth.
Hey, you guys. After hearing the stories from refugees who fled Sudan, I wanted to see for myself just what had happened in Darfur. There are 2 ways to get into Sudan, officially, with the blessings of the government, or unofficially. Not wanting the government to influence what I saw, I decided to go in unofficially. So today's journey starts just on the border of Sudan in the country of Chad, for the conclusion of our series, The Suffering of Sudan. My guide, wrapped in a turban, is a rebel supporter. I needed him to sneak into Darfur. We've just crossed the border into Sudan. You can see here the border is completely unprotected, and that's why we've chosen here to cross. Not far away, a group of rebels wait for us. These guys behind me here are members of the SLA, one of the main rebel groups here in Darfur. They began fighting the government in Sudan about 18 months ago for more control over resources here. The SLA, or Sudan Liberation Army, claims to control hundreds of miles of desert here in Darfur. One day, they hope to regain the land that they say was taken from them. Traveling with these rebels, I was hoping to see more candid evidence of damage caused by the pro-government Arab militia, or Janjaweed, who've burned villages and killed tens of thousands of people here. In the town of Furawiya, I'm reminded of stories I'd been told by refugees who'd fled Darfur.
The Janjaweed and the government, they attack our village and kill men, women, all people.
All signs of life here are gone. Carcasses of animals still lie in the desert. A hospital is only identifiable by broken bed frames. A school with papers scattered across the floor. Old shoes are left behind, and the market too is abandoned. But when the Janjaweed came through these villages and burned them, they burned these entire homes to the ground. Many of the SLA rebels lived in villages that were attacked by the Janjaweed. Muhammad's parents were both killed in one attack. Your brothers are in Chad in a refugee camp. Why did you decide to stay here and join the SLA?
There isn't any place for me to go. I want revenge.
He's not alone. 18-year-old Abdullah's father and older brother were killed too. And Joma, who's 15, watched as the Janjaweed killed his father. These soldiers say they're angry, and they're fighting for the liberation of Darfur. Not far from town, a crater made by a bomb dropped from an airplane. Nearby, a rocket lies in the sand. Rebels say this is evidence that the Sudanese government aided the Janjaweed in the vicious attacks against the ethnic African villagers.
When they attacked the village, they took anything, like radio, anything, ghosts, anything. When you speak with them, they shoot you.
And for some of the villagers who did not escape in time, they were rounded up, arrested, and brought here to the mountains, where many of them were shot. Right around me, there are about 15 dead bodies. Shot at close range, their bodies left to decay in the sun. Thousands of houses burned to the ground. 1.5 million people flee their homes. Hunger, disease, and starvation plague the survivors of this atrocity. But who is listening to these stories? And what is being done to help an entire population in crisis? People are now trying to answer those questions, but many have grumbled that the world has been too slow at reacting to the crisis in Darfur. This summer, Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas visited Darfur and then introduced a Senate bill calling for the declaration of genocide in Sudan. We sat down with him to ask him about the importance of this step.
What we have now is right in the middle of genocide. You've lost probably 50,000 people. You've got over 1 million in the refugee camps. Many more will die if the situation doesn't change. And we wanted the global community to act before everybody is killed. And so that we don't just look back and say, well, yes, that was genocide and we should have done something.
So we asked the senator, how can people help?
I would hope students would get on the internet, get on our website or others, and look for organizations that they feel like they could support and raise money and help them out.
As the senator mentioned, there are a number of organizations working to help the people in Darfur. And to find out how you can get involved, check out our website, channel1.com. And while you're there, don't miss the special audio tour of photos from my trip. Just click on The Suffering of Sudan. I think it's important to note that the rebels I traveled with have also been accused of committing crimes against civilians in the region.
Seth, it was shocking for me to see the images of those dead bodies. How long had they been there before you had arrived?
Well, they had been there for several months, but whenever you are that close to that kind of human devastation, it stays with you for a long time.
Very powerful series. Thanks, Seth.